Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first ever Leading Saints podcast and discussion. Um, we have here with us today Brother Chad Stewart. Excuse me, Stewart. I spelled it with a D the first time. Brother Chad Stewart, we're very happy that you're here with us. And you were recently released as the stake president, and you served in that calling for a total of 9 years. Is that correct?
That's right, Emily. It's awesome to be here with you. Thank you for having me.
So before you were called to become a stake president, what did you do? What were your callings before that?
I was on the High Council, and I had been on the High Council for about 14 or 15 months prior to be called as the stake president. My experience before that was different than a lot of stake presidents that you'll see. I've never served in a bishopric. So I went from being a scoutmaster to a high counselor to a stake president. So in the span of about 14 months, I went from being scoutmaster to stake president. Um, Before that, I had served as an elders quorum president for about 4 years. Uh, but yeah, I had a lot to learn in a very short period of time.
Okay, now give me a little bit more um, of a description about the stake that you served in. What wards and branches consisted of your stake?
When I was first called, we had 8 wards, 7 English speaking, and 1 for American Sign Language for the deaf. And about halfway through uh, my time as serving as stake president, we incorporated a Spanish speaking ward as well that made 9 wards, a total of about 3,300 people, 3,300 members. Um, the Spanish speaking ward consisted of 3 stakes, and the Salt Lake Valley second ward consists of about half of the Salt Lake Valley that goes from 45th South to the point of the mountain, both east to west from the Wasatch Mountains all the way to the Ochre Mountains.
So to be clear, just to give people who might not be in the state, to help them understand, our ward, the Salt Lake Valley Second Ward, was larger than the stake itself.
By quite a large, by an amazing amount of territory. Yeah, so the stake itself is probably a little bit more than a square mile, but a mile by mile square, whereas the Salt Lake Valley Second Ward um, is, if you're familiar with the Salt Lake Valley, it goes from about 45th South all the way to the point of the mountain.
Okay, so now starting to get into some more of the fun details. When you were initially called to become stake president, what was your experience with that being called?
With being called, well, I guess there's always a joke that sometimes people are, planning or trying to uh, campaign for a calling. I felt I was the least likely of anybody to be called for that. People asked me, "Did you feel like did the Spirit prepare you to be called a stake president?" And I said, "No. If it was preparing me, I wasn't listening." It was a surprise for myself, for my wife. Um, we were not expecting to be blessed with a 5th child, but my wife found out that she was pregnant about 2.5 weeks before I was called. We had just had a yard sale and sold our bassinets and our bottles and our car seats and our onesies and
Oh no, I
everything
didn't know
else.
that.
So yeah, we went from being kind of excited about all of our kids being in school to having a caboose 5 years younger, and then 2 weeks later, getting called as stake president. So our whole lives changed kind of overnight when it came to that. But both things were awesome and incredible blessings.
Okay, so now after you received the call to become stake president, what instruction and counsel did you receive um, that helped you in the initial stages of that journey to becoming a leader of the deaf ward, the ASL ward?
I don't think there's a lot of happenstance or randomness with the way that the Lord operates, and I think part of that was as I was counseled and interviewed with the visiting general authorities, the Area 70 that happened to be on assignment, and I don't happened probably isn't the right word, but was directed by the Lord to be there, and uh, by the president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, who makes those assignments, was Elder Doxey, and he happened to also be responsible for the affairs of the deaf in the state of Utah at that time. And there were a lot of uh, advancements that had been made prior to me being called, but there was, and even to this day, still is a great deal of opportunity to improve uh, the accessibility for the deaf within the affairs of the church. He stressed how important it was to be able to incorporate the deaf. Uh, and, I had lived in the stake up to that point um, for about 8 years or so, and was familiar with the Salt Lake Valley Second Ward, but hadn't developed any real friendships in that ward and didn't understand the dynamics of that ward very well. But in that moment, I felt inspired as one of the critical beginnings of my stake presidency is I called one of my counselors, who was my second counselor at the time, to be who was hard of hearing, Brother Brent Calder, to serve as my second counselor. And even though he wasn't proficient in ASL, he was incredibly empathetic of the situation that the deaf and hard of hearing had. He had lost most of his hearing at a very young age. Um, I love that man to death. He would spend so much time rehearsing and practicing his talks for state conference uh, because the pronunciation for someone who is hard of hearing is incredibly difficult, and he wanted to make sure that it was an uplifting experience for all involved, and so he was so meticulous in the way that he would um, communicate. And I know there was a great deal of individuals that looked up to him in the Salt Lake Valley Second Ward. And so, from the very beginning, I think we felt inspired to create the the foundation of a very deaf friendly environment as far as the stake leadership was concerned.
Okay, so before you were called as the stake president, you had no experience with sign language. You knew that there was the deaf ward within the stake, but that's basically all you had. So, what helped you on your journey to connect with the members of the ASL ward? What did you do? What kind of actions did you initiate?
I knew nothing about sign language. I remember in the fourth grade, we had a couple of deaf students that were going to different classes and teaching all the students the alphabet. And if you were able to go from A to Z in sign language, they gave you like some type of certificate. And I remember that I was one of only 3 or 4 people in my class that wasn't able to earn their certificate. And it wasn't because I didn't care, it was because I lacked talent. Um, and so it's interesting. I grew up speaking Spanish, and I've learned a great deal of Portuguese, and of course, English is my native language. And for me, sign language is more like learning how to play the piano than it is to speak a different language. It's a whole different skill set. It's so much muscle memory, it's dexterity, uh, and then you're combining that with different meanings and facial expressions. It's a very different language to learn. Um, and but I knew I was going to rely on interpreters, and we have been blessed with world-class interpreters that were by my side and continue to be by President Josh Smith's side as he carries on the torch, so to speak, as far as relationships with the deaf. Um, but I also knew that I needed to have enough personal interaction with the members of the Salt Lake Valley Second Ward that I couldn't always have an interpreter next to me, that I needed to be able to become conversational with the deaf. My first year as stake president, I was determined to learn how to be a stake president. And I said, I need to learn that language first. I need to become comfortable being a stake president because it's a very uncomfortable calling.
Yes.
But shortly after the first 6 months, we felt that there would be a lot of value. Uh, we felt that the Salt Lake Valley Second Ward was not well integrated. And we felt that as much as the Salt Lake Valley Second Ward wanted to integrate with the other English-speaking wards, it's all we had at the time were English-speaking wards, that it was going to have to come more from the hearing members of the English-speaking wards than from the Salt Lake Valley Second Ward, because it's just easier for that transition to happen that direction. So we started American Sign Language classes for hearing individuals, and we started to publicize that. And
So I'm curious, who taught those classes?
um, we we did our very best to have a deaf member teach those classes. I remember the very first class that we had. It was Eric Lynn was teaching, and he's very funny. He's a very good teacher, and um, we so much wanted him, and there was an interpreter there that was curious about how the class was going to go, who's a key member of our stake. Rania Bonick was there, and everyone wanted her to voice for Eric Lynn, and she said, I'm not going to say a word. You have to learn what he's doing. And, it's such a frustrating feeling because you have someone that's making all these signs with their hands. And, but you know what? We had about 60 people in that first class. And we were in the Relief Society room and it was packed. And we had members from every single ward. We had we had non-members from Tooele. I remember one brother, the word for priest came up, right? And there's priest and
Priest,
there's
yeah.
priest. And there was a Catholic guy, and he was saying, "Well, what isn't this priest?" Uh, and so it was fun to see some of those um, different people that would come from all different areas and backgrounds, and we have such a long and wonderful legacy of sister missionaries that have served in the Salt Lake Valley Second Ward, and they would attend, and they still attend, and we've had so many good referrals and so much community building from that. But what the end result was is, in which what I loved is I would go into the foyer after a Salt Lake Valley Second Ward sacrament meeting, and I would see members that didn't even attend that building that were there just conversing with deaf members in sign language. And we got to the point where myself, my wife, who had a couple semesters at Salt Lake Community College in ASL when she was in college, who has a lot of interest and excitement to be involved with the deaf community as well. We would go on double dates with different members of the Salt Lake Valley Second Ward, and really grew to develop some amazing friendships. But the end result was a stake that was extremely involved with each other. And, you know, I can remember in the early days of being a stake president where people would be concerned about where the interpreter was standing, or um, the way that the video would have, the different shots of video that would incorporate an interpreter. And those concerns just magically started to disappear as more and more members started to understand deaf culture and become advocates, and really were interested in participating in the inclusion of the deaf members.
So when you started the ASL classes, you started advertising to the different wards. Did you ask leaders to join, or was it just kind of a general advertisement? Anybody can come? I mean, did you try to encourage people to come? Was there partnerships with other organizations? How did you do that?
We would go to the deaf center just off of Redwood Road by off of 5400 South. Um, and we put flyers there. And we announced it to all of the wards in the stake. And then at that time, we had also, again, this was 2014 and 2015, we didn't really have a Facebook presence, but we were rapidly growing the Bennion, Utah Facebook page. And so as we were getting into the hundreds and even approaching into 1,000 followers on there, we would broadcast that through our social media, and it would get shared through a lot of individuals would reshare it to their own personal groups. Um,
Right.
the deaf take a lot of interest and pride in the fact that other people are learning to communicate in sign language. And so some of our greatest advocates for the ASL classes were deaf members who were sending it to family members and others that wanted to become more proficient in sign language. And so it grew pretty organically through that to where we'll take the summers off, but for now going on 9 years and beyond, it's become a staple of one of the services that we offer.
Yeah, that's really neat. So one thing that you mentioned in talking about the classes, how you started to develop more advocates within the stake that helps, the hearing members to become a little bit more considerate as far as interpreters you mentioned, what they do. How do you address the needs of your stake in regards to interpreters? How do you use interpreters on the stake level with, for example, temple interviews or bishopric trainings or stake conference? How do you go about using and coordinating interpreters?
Oh, I mentioned before, we've been so blessed with just amazing interpreters. We've always had an interpreter coordinator. And this is someone that ideally this person is fluent in sign language themselves. We've had Sister Kathy Hewlick, who has since passed away, but is a dear friend of mine, and her husband, Arlo Hewlick, at that time, just wonderful people. And in fact, she moved to the stake with the sheer intention of being closer to the deaf saints. Um, and she was such a wonderful coordinator. And then we've also had individuals um, like Sister Rania Bonnick, who was a good example of identifying every single person in and outside of the deaf ward that had sign language background. So she's a certified interpreter and does that professionally. And she was willing to be, for a period of time, our interpreter coordinator. And then the list goes on and on. We had both brother and sister Melander who served in that capacity. So we had both hearing, interpreter background individuals and deaf members that served as that interpreter coordinator. We would take it upon ourselves to, if we knew that a meeting was going to take place and involved the deaf in any capacity, it could have been one person or it could have been 100 or more people that were deaf. We needed to have an interpreter present. And then we'd always take into consideration how long the meeting was going to be. If the meeting was going to be longer than a half an hour, then we needed to have more than one interpreter there so that they could trade off. It's a very taxing environment for that interpreter. Your mind is, ingesting one thing and you're spitting out something else at the exact same time, and you do that for a long period of time, it can just absolutely wear you out. And so we were always going to be considerate that we had enough resources and enough interpreters there, depending on the length of the meeting.
So, quick question. Your interpreters, were they in did they have the calling as an interpreter? Were they paid? How did you work out the interpreting situation?
We have a number of interpreters that live outside of the stake. And so what we did is we contacted their stake leadership and asked them if they would allow for us to give them an assignment that we would set them apart to be an interpreter. So this didn't preclude the interpreter from having a calling within their own ward or stake, but we also wanted them to have the benefit of having a priesthood blessing that was associated with their interpreting. And so as we developed this, we had a formal opportunity to meet with those interpreters. We've, there are a lot of resources that you can use as far as interpreters go. Local leaders they're not always going to have the same resources that we have here in Salt Lake, and that's understandable. But I can tell you how many phone calls I would get from a deaf member that was using a video phone relay system to call my cell phone, and you can tell right off the bat that it's a video phone because you have an interpreter that is voicing for the deaf person. And you can usually tell because like weird words that we have in the church like stake and ward and bishop, and the interpreter is like,
Yeah.
they're trying to come up with these words like, what are they saying? Like, they're coming up with different translations for things. And but 98% of everything that those video phone interpreters are doing is spot on, and they hold themselves to extremely high code of conduct when it comes to confidentiality and so forth. So even something that simple, if you're in a important situation that you need to have a conversation with someone that you don't want to have as much clarity in what they're trying to communicate, even having that deaf member use a video phone to speak with use a video phone service to speak to a priesthood leader would be much better than not having an interpreter at all.
Yeah. So, another question for you to help our audience maybe understand a little bit better with interpreters during meetings and maybe state conferences. What was your setup with the interpreters to be able to be inclusive of the deaf members there? What would you do as far as where the interpreter would stand? What technology would you use?
It evolved a great deal over time. and the handbook of instruction has evolved a little bit on this matter as well. We always asked the deaf members, and we had good representation. We had some wonderful members of the High Council that were deaf that I could lean on and ask what they thought. I would ask Relief Society presidencies, bishoprics, what is the best environment? I understand what there's some general guidelines, but what's the best environment for the deaf? And if there's a large group of deaf members, that means that they need to spread throughout the congregation. They can't just be in a very tight group. And so in a situation like that, it's ideal to have an interpreter that's standing next to the speaker, next to the podium on the rostrum with that person. Oftentimes you'll see in a state conference that they are broadcasting that on a large screen or multiple screens, and that allows for the deaf member or members to sit really anywhere within the congregation and to be able to see both the facial expressions, which is important to understand the seriousness or the playfulness or the sarcasm, or if they're joking as far as the speaker is concerned, as they're also looking at that interpreter. And so to have them in the same frame, that's ideal. Many times we would have regional meetings, and it would require that we'd only have maybe 5 or 6 deaf people out of a congregation of 300 or 400 people or more. In that, it didn't make sense to have that interpreter standing at the rostrum, at the pulpit next to the speaker, because we could work with the presiding authority and have all those deaf members sitting in the first couple rows to the side of that sacrament chapel, and we could have the interpreter either standing up in the direct line of sight below the pulpit, or to be sitting in a chair, but it allowed for the deaf members to have a line of sight where they're looking at the speaker, as well as being able to see the interpreter without needing to do drastic head movements. So they could look and they could see
Right.
ideally all in one motion. And then as technology advanced, we invested, and the church was very responsive with the FM group. We made a major commitment to technology specific for the deaf, and it allowed for us to have multiple cameras in our chapel. And with those multiple cameras, it allowed for us to do a picture-in-picture where we would do a green screen and have the interpreter sit in front of the green screen off to the side of, if you think your typical chapel, it would be in front of the where the sacrament is typically blessed. And we would have a green screen there, and we'd have that interpreter sitting to the side. But then when you were looking at the actual broadcast, you would see the interpreter in a picture-in-picture right alongside the speaker. And that was an amazing technological advancement for us, and it allowed for us to also broadcast picture-in-picture hymns, to where the deaf could follow kind of like a bouncing ball type of a technology. When the hymn would be sung by the hearing members, the deaf could sign in coordination with how it was being sung by the hearing members at the same time.
Okay, so I'm curious, when you would have a visiting general authority come to the stake, how would you prepare them to understand the needs of the deaf members during those meetings?
Yeah, that's a good question. The visiting authorities they're very well prepared when they come to the stake. And the reason why they're well prepared is they will have a series of phone calls with the stake president in preparation for those meetings. And so without fail, every single time that they would ask about the conditions of the stake and the needs of the stake and any special considerations for the stake, I would talk to them about the Salt Lake Valley Second Ward. And I would help them understand some cultural things as well. Help them understand about whatever the situation was, what the preference was for the interpreters. And without fail, they wanted to do what was in the best needs of the members. And so they really wanted to understand that. And I'd also tell them that, the deaf enjoy recognition, but they don't enjoy being pandered to. And so help them enjoy the experience, but you don't need to make special attention to the deaf outside of what you would make to really any other member that's in there. And so I would help them understand some specifics as far as deaf culture, and that would be helpful for them so that they could understand some of those things. And then we always made an effort to include the deaf when it came to talks and participate in choir numbers. We'd have the deaf youth if we had a primary choir, we would have the primary kids, we'd have representation in sign language from the deaf primary. I can remember one time where we were short a prayer, and I was able to convince your daughter at the last minute to give a prayer.
I remember that. And
Um,
yeah, she knew enough. You knew enough sign at that time. Yeah, she signed that
yes, yeah,
prayer.
and we couldn't get anyone. Yeah, so we couldn't find someone, and I'm looking around like, who can I get in the congregation that I can sign to? And so I was like, hey, it's like, can your daughter say a prayer for us, please?
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right.
And so,
And she was more than willing. She was willing to do
yeah,
it.
yeah. And so, but those would be things that we would do in concert with those visiting authorities. I'll tell you what, the one consistent thing that so when you have a visiting authority, they would sit down and talk to the stake presidency afterward and just kind of do like a review of what they thought and so forth. And the spirit that was contributed from the deaf members, without a doubt, was the number one thing that was consistently spoken of by those visiting authorities. And they would say things to the extent of, I will never be the same since I was able to visit your stake and see the way that the deaf are participating and thriving within your stake. It was something that really made an impression on those visiting authorities that I felt was something that one visiting authority at a time, we were making a difference as far as understanding of what could be possible for the deaf.
So, with that in mind, you did an excellent job at the stake level of being inclusive of deaf members at that level as well. Can you share your experience of, what callings um, included the deaf? At the time, you also called, I believe it was two different bishops during your time as stake president. Is that correct? I'm trying to
I did.
remember.
I did.
I think it was at
I,
least two new bishops.
I called two. I called two bishops. I called one just before I was released, Bishop Price, who's currently serving, and called Bishop Jonathan Hodson, and Keith Lauritzen was the bishop when I was called, so he was already serving as the bishop.
That's right. That's right. He was the bishop at that time.
Three amazing men, one of the things that people
So,
don't,
and they're all deaf, just to
all,
make sure
all,
that the
all of them are
audience is
deaf.
aware every one of those bishops was
All of them
deaf.
are deaf. Um, and three very different people, three very wise and very intelligent people. Um, I really gained an appreciation the way that there's different degrees of how a deaf person will communicate, and a lot of that is dependent on the level of hearing, and different deaf individuals might lose their hearing as a toddler, or they might be profoundly deaf and have never heard anything at all in their life. Um, Others lose their hearing, in their teenage years or later. There's such a wide variety. Um, that level of hearing has zero bearing on that person's capabilities or their intelligence or their wisdom or their testimony. Um, but you have to be able to understand how to communicate with that person based off of their communication tendencies. And all three of those bishops are quite deaf. I remember I was walking along Jonathan Hodson, Bishop Hodson. We were going to the Jordan River Temple for the dedication. We were on with all the youth, and we were walking along Redwood, and a really big truck honked his horn. It was loud, and Bishop Hodson says, "I could hear that horn," and he was excited that he could hear that horn. So I know there was a little bit of hearing, but not very much. And so when I would get emails from some of these bishops, um, for English and for the hearing person, you think that person is going to write in the same type of English that you write in. And it's not the case because it's so different that they're memorizing. I'm a horrible speller myself, and I've been able to hear my whole life. In fact, it's one of the worst parts
Myself
of
as
my
well.
sign language is I can't spell in English, let alone spell in sign language. Um,
Most people can't.
yeah. And so, you think about how complicated English is, and these deaf individuals are memorizing sentence structure because they've never heard it in their minds before. They've never sounded it out as they were learning how to read like you would if you were hearing. And so it's truly a foreign language that they're trying to master to be able to communicate with you in your world. Um, it just goes to show that it's very important that you don't just simply rely on the written communication, but you have good interpreters, and you're able to have as much face-to-face interaction with those local bishops, Relief Society presidents, young women presidents. But we had good bishops, amazing bishops. We've had deaf members of the High Council, a number of deaf elders quorum presidents. In fact, your husband, Emily, being one of those great deaf elders quorum presidents that I was able to call during that time.
That's right.
Um, and we, the current stake young women's president, who is just dynamic in every way possible, and is she's such a powerful woman and such someone that I really I've had two daughters that went to that young women's program, one that's currently 17 years old. And when I called President Stephanie Morgan to be the stake young women's president, it was someone that I was excited for my own daughter to be able to look up towards. But it doesn't go without saying that you have to make special accommodations for that. You have to be able to create resources available so that stake young women's president in this case can be successful. I mentioned Sister Bonnick before. She was called to be her counselor, who Sister Bonnick is amazing in every way possible to be in the Stake Young Women's presidency, but to add to that, that she's an interpreter, and to add to the fact that she has a strong relationship with the deaf members was really divinely inspired and something that the Lord had put into place so that this Stake Young Women's presidency could be very successful in its own right, and they continue to be successful and have had treks, and they're preparing right now for Stake Girls Camp next summer, and it's it's really important if it's a Spanish speaking ward, if it's an American Sign Language ward, to be able to have hearing people be able to learn from a leader that is a little bit different than they are. And it's also important. So in the case with the deaf, it's important for the deaf to see that someone that is more similar to them is leading in capacities outside of the ward as well. So it's important for both the hearing and the deaf to have that level of representation. If the Spirit is telling you as a leader, this person should be in this calling, then your next question is, how can I make sure they're successful? Not, should I find someone else because it's going to be easier? If the Spirit's going to tell you to call that person, then make sure you're able to find the way for that person to be successful.
Awesome. So that kind of inspired another thought. The two of us, we kind of had a cool experience with the calling that you gave me as the Deaf Symposium and FSDY chairperson. Um, that has really opened some amazing doors and connections with people all across the country because with the Deaf Symposium as well as FSDY, we were able to recruit an audience that was outside of just our little stake, but all over the entire United States, people came and gathered together. So for those who don't know what I'm talking about, FSDY stands for the Strength of the Deaf Youth. The two of us worked closely together to um, establish the pilot program for that, as well as we worked together closely to continue the legacy of the Deaf Symposium. And that is something somewhat similar to BYU Education Week. A similar concept, the deaf all come together, and we all just are able to communicate in sign language. So it was a wonderful opportunity that we had to bring together both adults as well as youth. And can you share your experience, some of your observations throughout that process?
Well, I think things got started a little bit, Emily, with Rick Jensen when it came to seminary and institutes. We were looking for an agent stake that could facilitate the seminary and institute learning of both youth and adults in the deaf community. And the church operates, in a inspired hierarchical structure of return and report, and a lot of that is language based, but the deaf were constantly being um, left out a little bit because in a typical area presidency in Japan, in the Asia area, they'll have responsibility for Japanese materials and so forth, or in South America they'll have Spanish and Portuguese, and the list goes on. But the deaf didn't really have that language component to it, and they didn't have someone that was directly advocating on a church level for them at that time. And so it required for a agent stake president to be someone that would endorse and advocate for that. And so when Rick came and said, hey, we need to have some infrastructure put in place for seminary and institutes, I think that was the first time that we kind of learned the secret to being able to advocate on the local level. And it went from that to having the first deaf symposium that I was involved with. We had it at the Salt Lake Community College, and you were heavily involved with that. I still have my salt bottle that you gave me. Um, uh, and it was a
The
very
salt of the earth. That's
all of
yes.
the earth, yes. Um, we it was very successful. We had people coming from all over the United States to the Salt Lake Community College. Um, and we had to learn some things from a financial standpoint of how can we make it so that it's financially self-sufficient and properly accounted for and audited and so forth. And so we learned a lot doing that. But not to go into too many details, but uh, we had the same opportunity when the church came out with For the Strength of Youth, and they took the EFY concept. Um, it's so inspired the way that they're able to advocate and provide opportunities for the youth. The deaf learn in a completely different way than the hearing do, and most of the hearing don't appreciate the extremities. Like for example, at FSY having a big dance, for example, the way that the deaf uh, dance and have music and can enjoy that type of environment is very different from the hearing. The classroom
Mhm.
environment is very different. Um, the types of activities are very different. Um, when someone is deaf, most of them are completely healthy, but there's other health considerations that are involved with someone that contributed to why they were deaf in the first place. There could be physical situations and so forth. So there's so many different variables that took place that we really felt that the the FSY needed to have a deaf representation that was run by the deaf in the deaf language for ASL and under the culture of the deaf culture, to where if you were hearing, you would need an interpreter. Not that the deaf would ever need an interpreter. That you're going into their environment, into their world. And the church was so supportive of this, and they really bent over backwards. Katie Steed was incredible with that. Um, and for the first couple of years, they just wanted to observe and to learn. They didn't go in there saying, "We know more than you do. Let us observe and understand. We can give you some guidelines." But as they learned and they saw this, and it resulted in um, the creation of a deaf board of an advisory board for the deaf that is led by Elder Johnson, who's been an amazing advocate for the deaf as well, and was highly involved. Everyone that's touched this has felt the manifestation of the Holy Spirit to know that this is so divinely inspired, to the extent that if it's for the adults with the Deaf Symposium, which is a variation of like a BYU Education Week, but it's very much inspired by deaf uh, specific needs within the gospel itself. So classes that you would never see at BYU Education Week are involved with the Deaf Symposium. Um, and then with the For the Strength of Deaf Youth, uh, both of those programs were observed by the church and were wholeheartedly accepted and are now being incorporated on a much more consistent basis on the church level. But all of those things, FSDY, the Deaf Symposium, as well as the advisory board, are all a direct result of what we were able to accomplish at the Bennion, Utah stake. And it goes to so many people that deserve credit for that. But I honestly, I feel that if we didn't take those initial steps, that we wouldn't have been able to achieve that, and we wouldn't have those resources in place. Um, and I think that the moral of that story is if you're a local leader, you can create miracles in your own backyard if you take the initiative. Don't feel like you have to be limited. You can really do something that can be a positive influence in that local community.
So that's a great lead into my next question for you. With all the opportunities that you had being involved with the Deaf Symposium for Strength of Deaf Youth, leadership opportunities, contacting, calling individuals to become a part of the planning committees, um, that, these individuals that lived in other states meant that you were contacting their local leadership, their stake presidents, their bishops. What was that interaction like with those stake presidents?
They were so excited. So we would contact stake presidents in Idaho and Arizona and California and Washington, D.C. and Florida and all over the country. And those stake leaders desperately wanted what we were offering for their deaf members. And they wanted to have that level of interactivity. We were creating a fairly large organization. I can't remember how many we had, Emily, but it was dozens and dozens of
Yeah,
how many
yes. It
it was
was a
I
lot of
remember
work calling. I
it was a
probably
lot
have
because
over 40
I was
people.
talking to a lot of state presidents. Um, and we were getting people that have been serving on their high council, like Joseph Featherstone, for example, uh, was uh, had been serving on a high, I mean, very spiritually talented people, and their stake presidents were so excited about the opportunity that they were getting, but they were also they felt like they were at a loss generally about being able to provide these types of resources. And it was a breath of fresh air to many of them that they were able to understand that these resources were being made available. Really, it's just the tip of the iceberg. There's so many things available to the local leaders. Um, those local leaders that don't understand necessarily how to involve some of their deaf members as well as they truly want to, it's not because they don't want to involve them. They're just not exactly clear on how to involve those members many times. Um, their hearts, I've never found that their hearts were ever in the wrong place. It was just part of the same learning curve that I had to go through myself, which is generally the case for anyone that isn't familiar with deaf culture.
So, what advice, if you have any thoughts, um, or final tips on how people, leaders, can be more inclusive of the deaf members in their congregations?
Um, there can be resources made available for financial assistance for interpreters. The church has that. You can budget for that. Um, if you don't have local resources, the first thing I always look for is what are my local resources? Um, you're going to have stakes. A typical stake is going to have 5 to 12 wards in a stake, and you're going to have individuals that are returned missionaries that served ASL missions. Doesn't mean they're great interpreters, as we know that interpreters. It's a highly uh, developed skill. You can be fluent in sign language, not be a great interpreter. but anything is better than nothing, and you can find people that can help in that capacity. But you do have the availability to have funds that you can allocate towards interpreters. Additionally, uh, if you have any special needs at all in your ward or stake, this can be learning disabilities, this can be Down syndrome, this can be Asperger's, this can be deaf individuals. There's there are callings for special needs advocates, that they are liaisons for the special needs, and that's their calling. If you've got those individuals in your ward or stake, then there's a calling that you can have someone become that advocate and look for how to incorporate that better. Because a bishop and a stake president, they are doing so much and they're worried about so many things. They can't get into all those details all the time. So to have someone that's praying about that exclusively and going to bed and dreaming about, different solutions and things like that, that's valuable. There's so much in technology that you can do as a local leader. Um, if you're using a conference talk or a clip of a conference talk, every single conference talk since, I don't know, early 2000 has an ASL companion. So instead of just downloading or showing the English version, you can go to the language settings and choose ASL as the language, and the video is going to have picture in picture of a very prepared interpreter that has prepared the exact interpretation and signing of that talk beforehand. So they have the advantage of really preparing to have really high quality interpreting. Um, you can add closed captioning to almost any video, which is a great blessing to someone. I always try to take any quote or any type of class environment, and I try to put it into a PowerPoint so that the deaf members could read the quote that we were using. Just really small things like that. Um, if you have,
So I do remember one thing that you did during state conferences that really showed how much effort and preparation you put into this. Um, you had the ASL video up and it was spoken English, and then you also had English captions and Spanish captions for the Spanish members. Is that correct?
yeah, there was so much going on there that it was like the World Expo. Um, and like you could barely see the speaker because you had person that was signing over here, and then you had Spanish that's going on down here, and you had English that was going on up here, and then you had this person that was speaking kind of in the middle of all this. But it allowed for everyone to be able to really, the Lord, when he goes to the Nephites, he speaks to them in their language. When he's going to visit in the New Jerusalem, he's going to speak to us in our language. Paul made an effort to speak to the Greeks and to the Romans and to the Hebrews and in their own language. And so, we made a great effort to make sure that everyone could be as comfortable as possible and to feel the Spirit in their native way of communicating. Uh, and I remember one time in particular, it was uh, it was humorous because I had a picture in picture of a conference talk that I was using as I would do a lot of kind of questions and answers type of conferences for a Saturday evening. And I had a video up and we couldn't get the audio to work. And so the video starts to play, but there's no audio. And so the deaf members, they don't know. They're just watching it and they're seeing an interpreter signing the whole thing, but all the hearing members don't know what's happening in the video because there's no audio. And so as we were trying to figure it out, I said, look how the shoe's on the other foot. Now you get to understand what it's like to be deaf for a little bit. And people started to laugh, but it was all in good fun because our members had become so comfortable with the deaf, and they desperately want for that level of comfort for the deaf and for the Spanish speaking members, or anybody for that matter, that it became really common for them. They became very used to that type of an environment.
True. Well, as a member of the stake, I want to express my great appreciation for all the effort that you put into making everything accessible. It was just fantastic. I think that my last question for you um, is how has interacting with the deaf saints helped you become a better disciple of Jesus Christ?
Um, it changes you as a person. I remember when I was young, I started learning Spanish, and my dad would always he didn't care what grades I got, except for my Spanish grades. I could get like a C minus in math, and I probably was getting a C minus in math. I was not a great student, but as long as I could get an A in Spanish, he was happy with my report card. And I can remember one time I asked him, I said, Dad, why is it so important to you that I learn Spanish? And he said, Chad, it's not so important to me that you learn Spanish, but it's important to me that you learn people. And if you learn Spanish, you'll learn how to identify with a whole group of people that you would never have identified with otherwise. That's why it's important to me that you learn Spanish. And I'll put that in the same thing with when I started to learn sign language. I'm conversational in sign language. I don't pretend to be an expert signer. Um, but I got to the point to where I could give talks in church and teach classes and work as an ordinance worker in sign language in the Jordan River Temple. And those are life-changing things. But it's not the language, and it's not even the culture. Those are so important things for a leader to understand. But at the end of the day, it's people, it's souls. Um, Great is the worth of the soul. And I became acquainted with people's souls. Um, I had virtually no deaf friends before I was called a stake president, and now I've got hundreds of friends on Facebook and in other places that are deaf, members of the church, people who are not members of the church, people from different states that reach out to me, and I feel such a great level of camaraderie and friendship and love for deaf members and deaf people in general. I was commenting that the other day I was walking through Home Depot and I could see someone struggling with a sprinkler problem, and the guy that was working there was struggling to help him, and I was able just to stop in, and in my people will say in sign language that people have different accents. Like we always would make fun of Brother Hussein because he's got a different accent when he signs, and people have different accents.
Yeah.
And people would say, "What's your accent, President Stewart, when you sign an ASL?" And I would tell them, "I have the accent of a toddler when I sign an ASL." And so you can imagine me using my toddler ASL accent, um, explaining to this guy how to winterize his sprinklers in Home Depot with sign language. But he was so excited, and there was such this level of camaraderie because I could communicate with him. And quite frankly, the deaf, they don't need you to be perfect in sign language. The fact that you're trying is such a monumental significant show to them about the level of dedication and love you have to be able to get to know them on a more personal level. I don't know, you don't have to be a stake president. You don't have to be a Relief Society president. You don't have to have quote unquote these important callings to learn how to be an advocate for the deaf. Um, the deaf deserve to have every resource possible. I firmly have a testimony that Heavenly Father wants his deaf sons and daughters to access the gospel and have access to the Holy Spirit just like any of his other children. But for that to come to fruition, it's going to require a lot of hearing people to learn how to advocate for the deaf, because they're swimming upstream, so to speak. It's not their natural environment to be able to make these changes. They're 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 the away team. They're not the home team. They're always going into somebody else's gymnasium and trying to outscore you. And they really need to have people that are on their team that identify and understand and can advocate for them. Because and it's not because of any ill will by the hearing. It's just the hearing don't understand how little they understand. They don't know what they don't know. And until you've been in those situations, you really can't advocate very well. But as more people gain that level of understanding from a hearing perspective, then you can advocate. And that's my commitment is I want to be able to advocate for the deaf no matter what my calling is. And I think I can do that. And it's being a friend, it's being supportive, it's doing an interview like this. But how has my life changed? My life has dramatically changed, and it will never be the same. And it rewires the way your brain works. You can't think of things the same way ever since you have this type of an experience. Um, but I do have a great deal of love for the deaf community. And you know what? It's not just a one-way street. I know they love me too, and they tell it to me all the time. And I love that. There's
It's
there's
true.
nothing greater than going down the street and someone telling you, "Hey, I love you." Who doesn't like that? And now I can have that in English, in Spanish, in Portuguese, and American Sign Language, and hopefully every other language, because to me, that's what Zion's about, is about a bunch of people that come from different backgrounds that have their hearts knit together, and they're all in common believers in Christ and are just incredibly interested in each individual welfare of each person, regardless of what their background is.
Thank you, Brother Chad, so much for everything that you've shared with us. During those last thoughts that you shared, it brought up a thought about Brother Nelson, or President Nelson, excuse me, when he was learning Chinese, when he talked about that journey and leading him to become friends with some Chinese people. And you are a friend to the deaf community. You opened your heart and let us in. And there's a bond there that will last forever. Everything that you've done in your service, I know, that doesn't just go out the window. Once you're released, that's something that you're going to continue to do. So that change is going to be lasting. Thank you again so much for your time and willingness to join with us today. Thank you.